So now I thought since there have been, the questions have been great. It's not like you're ever a shy audience or free associative at all, much like IT is not siloed.
Dave introduces himself.
Again.
We wanted to kind of bite this off as a discrete section of the recording of the day, because talking about now, what are we doing for the kind of the dev side of the house? I think a lot of that previous conversation was a little more ops-centric, but blueprinting, infrastructure as code, what we're doing around Ansible, all those topics are kind of worthy of their own module here. And so hopefully we hit on some of the questions you were asking that we may have put a pin in till now.
Cool. Well, I will introduce myself again. My name is David Estes. I'm the VP of Engineering at Morpheus and co-founder, basically responsible for the day-to-day direction of the product. I've been around since the beginning, so feel free to ask questions throughout this presentation. So we're going to start talking about the automation side of Morpheus. We've looked at some of the provisioning, and one of the things we like to talk about on the automation side is how do you tie into configuration management, some of the operational task capabilities that are new to the product since the last time we were here, as well as cloud-native template support, blueprinting, and provisioning workflows. So let me go ahead and dive into the product here. We talked about provisioning earlier, and one of the things we talked about is how you could tie in automation. So if I go to automation, there's two things here. One is I can actually very easily tie an Ansible playbook, a chef recipe, a Puppet. I can write Bash, PowerShell, all these different types of tasks in the Morpheus automation engine. And this can also be accessible via the API, which I'll also get into in a second. One of the cool things I will talk about later is some cool stuff we have with Ansible that I would like to dive into. But you can actually tie it to your Ansible repositories, kick off a playbook, and actually set execution targets and retry events as well. So we'll get into that. This is kind of where that talks about, kind of links into how Rundeck would work originally, right? So this is kind of a Rundeck replacement. There's a ton of other integrations I will go into here, but first let's talk about blueprinting. So we deployed a single self-service catalog item in the product earlier. It was a web server. But what if I had a full application stack? There's a couple ways you could deploy it. You could actually write it infrastructure as code with Terraform, which limits you a little bit in how you can automate it after the fact. It's really kind of siloed. Or you can tie into things like ARM or CloudFormation. You can see there's several template types as well. And more recently, Kubernetes specs or Helm charts are also available. Out of the box, Morpheus also provides its own base level one. And this is more for those kind of, depending on where you are in your DevOps adventure, more traditional in that you can actually define, I have a multi-tier application. It's got these service catalog items. You can actually get a preview, a visual preview that's automatically generated. There's an infrastructure as code piece where you can define this as YAML or JSON as well. We'll talk about how you build that. But this example here, what's cool about it is I can actually say this tier is connected to the database tier. This is the boot order, so we can do sequenced boots. I can say this is the catalog item. For example, if I wanted to add another one here, you see that whole service catalog we provided out of the box where you've customized, you have access to do that. So the other cool thing you can do is you can add multiple configuration scopes. So say you have an application that you want to deploy, sometimes it's container-based or as VM-based or maybe in Azure or AWS. You actually define the configuration overrides for that scoped group, cloud, or environment. And when a consumer goes to self-service provision this blueprint, it will automatically inherit those properties. For example, if I click this AWS on the Tomcat, you can see a few things here. It's got all those options we saw earlier with adding a AWS instance, but it's also got a code deployment. It's pushing out code from an artifact repository deployment that we set up. It's actually creating that ELB. It's also setting up a scale factor of 3, so it's going to scale out 3 of these Tomcat servers within that instance. It is important to note that an instance in Morpheus does not represent a single container, a single VM, or a single bare metal. It represents more of the service. You can think of it like a Kubernetes pod.
All right, so you can pull your code from your own code repo that you've specified.
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And so scaling this is very easy. The database is the same way. I also even can deploy seed data to a database based on this catalog item. You can see, give it your database initial password. These are all custom catalog items you can build. This is one that's out of the box, but you can completely do this yourself. Deploying it's very easy. I can just say, okay, I want to go deploy this application. I go to new app, find that blueprint I built, give it a name, CFD6. Let's actually put it on AWS, I think. So demo group, AWS. It's going to give you a review, estimated cost. Hit complete. It's going to make sure there's capacity, do some validation checks, and then it should push that out.
Yeah, while this is running, you're showing this through the GUI, but obviously, if you're running some sort of pipeline deployment process where you want to stand up the infrastructure that's going to host the application, you're probably going to do that through an API or some kind of command line. So, what integrations do you already have with existing pipelines? I guess would be
on the wrong
part of my
version.
question.
I'm on the wrong version of Ruby, apparently. Yes. Give me a second here. So one of the things I should mention is, it's under support. You can see API documentation. So everything I've been doing through this UI, you can do via a RESTful OAuth-based API. And we have a CLI built around that as well, which I did change my Ruby versions yesterday. So this is what happens when you live code. Let's use default, or let's try system. We're just gonna see, this is what happens when we code live. Sorry, guys. So I'm installing the Morpheus CLI. There's a Docker version of this as well. There's a Windows version of this. Apparently, my binary path is wrong, so we should do this. Okay, we'll have to show that later. Sorry, guys.
A valiant effort.
Forgot to
This is
check
how you
that.
know it's not pre-recorded.
Yes. That is my fault. My environment's my dev box, so I messed that up. But basically, there's a CLI. It's actually got 550 different API endpoints on it. You can do anything ranging from deploying an application blueprint via that CLI, application. You can even do virtual image uploads. If you've got, say, an OVA you want to push up to vCenter, you can do it through Morpheus via that. Virtual image conversion, tons of stuff there. Managing your tenants, roles, users, all that is exposed via that CLI as well. All using this documented public developer API.
When you say VM conversion, you mean from any to any?
Not all types are supported from any to any, but for example, I can convert a VMDK to a QCOW or to a RAW or to a VHD and deploy that to different clouds.
To an AMI?
Yes, because that'll kick off an AMI import. So I can do a VMware to AWS, but I cannot do an AWS to VMware, for example.
Okay.
And that's just because you pay the tax. You send data to Amazon, getting it out. That's your problem.
Does it have is there an image builder too?
Yes.
Okay.
And that talks about that automation, so we actually have it right here. When we talk about those hypervisor level consoles we provide, we built a way, initially we did this for a customer for VMware where we actually can send the keyboard commands over VNC over that hypervisor console, similar to what you've seen in HashiCorp's Packer. So you can send boot commands. We actually have the ability for you to find your boot scripts and pre-seed scripts, which you can reference. This is a CentOS 7 boot script saying wait 5, type tab, type text, Kickstarter, enter the URL, and go. And then your script looks something like this, which if you're familiar with Kickstart files, it's pretty standard type of structure. And then Morpheus can actually do these image builds and maintain them. I've got a couple executions in here. We can see execution history. And you can actually have it version the image for reference or automatically reassociate it to a catalog item. So say you want to kick this off to run every 2 weeks or 2 months for security, make sure your golden image is up to date. You could do that.
Does it automatically import it into vSphere as well, like in vCenter?
Because it's doing the work in vCenter.
Right. Oh, so it's leveraging it
Yeah.
for the builder.
Correct.
Yeah, can I tie it into something like a Nessus or something to get a security scan?
Soon. That's kind of a roadmap item, and I'll talk about that here later on. But you could via automation workflows, but there's going to be a native feature with compliance and security scans coming here pretty soon that I'll talk about.
Now, can you have this, once something's deployed and you've got your golden image, can you have it go and check and analyze your existing deployed objects and images in order to make sure that they haven't deviated from their paths a little bit, and stuff that wasn't originally deployed in this, and like, no, we have a golden standard, you should be following this. It's part of the automation story.
Right, so typically when you build a catalog item, it'll swap out, like it's able to figure out that, hey, the previous image was associated with this catalog item, swap it out. So it'll automatically, all new things, greenfield provision here forward will use that new golden image. The old stuff, you can use different workflows and job schedules to run tasks to kick off patching and things like that. There's a cool thing with the roadmap that it's related to your question and his question that kind of go together with the Nessus scan. And it's one of the things we started to do is we actually can look at installed software now. So we can track the installed software on the VMs, and we update that, I believe, every 7 days, just to keep load down on the payloads and things like that. But you can customize that. And then we can actually scan. We actually are downloading the NIST database now. And monitor, and the differentials, which I think you have 8 days to do. And then we're actually doing CPE rule matching against the installed software now. So that's a roadmap item that we've actually got done in QA, but it's not in production yet. But you'll be able to map it to expose CVEs, things like that, on each individual host and resource. And that will be pluggable as well. So you'll be able to tie into external third-party security scanning tools like a Nessus.
So
like
in his Nessus example, also OpenVAS, the free Nessus or Qualys or something like that, those are all kind of on that path?
Yeah, exactly. Yep. And that's a big push we are doing. Just that's part of that day 2, right? It's new. It's early on where we're at with it, but we really want to kind of go into that area a little bit and offload what we can, though, because we don't want to become a full security scanning tool. We'd offload to a Nessus. The intent of our NIST scan is just to give you a high level, like, hey, these are definitely obvious vulnerabilities you got to deal with, things like that. Cool. Going back to automation, one thing I really like to show is our automation integration. So we talked about 85 integrations. Ansible Integration is probably my favorite, is the most popular right now. We do support Ansible Tower. You do not need it. You can use it if you would like to, and we can actually, clone from the job templates to create jobs, map inventory to it. The other thing you can do is you can just say, hey, I've got an Ansible repo with my playbooks. Give it the get URL, your key pair, set your roles path, your group variable path. You can turn on verbose logging. You can also turn on Morpheus Agent Command Bus. This one's really cool. We have a couple customers in the health sector who decided they wanted to use Ansible, but firewalls don't allow them to. They can't use WinRM, they can't use SSH. Ansible kind of requires those things to start orchestrating on an OS. We found a way around that. We've actually exposed a Morpheus connection plugin that leverages that agent optional we talked about, where all the Ansible playbook execution can happen via Morpheus agent. So the Ansible binary can talk back to Morpheus directly and instruct it to send the commands or relay them to the host for execution and response. And that requires no changes to your existing playbooks. You don't have to modify your playbooks to work with this. It just works. We have several customers using this now, so much so that we've had some who have literally not bought Tower as a result and just used us. That being said, if you want to use Tower, go for it. You can, and eventually we will expose that connection plugin to the Tower side as well.
So that communication channel, is it, you still have to have a firewall port at some point, right?
Right, so how does the agent communication work, right? So when you install an agent on a VM, we don't need SSH or WinRM to install it because we can do it over sysprep or over Cloud Init. So the client itself on first boot is doing it essentially. It basically needs no ingress, so it opens no ingress ports on the VM. It needs access egress to the Morpheus appliance URL.
Okay.
So it just needs to be able to talk back to Morpheus, essentially.
So it checks in and then everything.
What it does is it actually opens a 443 secure WebSocket.
Okay.
So it's constant, so there's no polling delay. So if there's a command execution that Morpheus needs to tell a VM to do, it's almost instant.
Okay. Yeah. So do you see Morpheus replacing a CICD pipeline tool or just augmenting one?
Augmenting, I would say, not replacing.
Okay.
And there's so many different key use cases with CICD. It really just the way the API works is it simplifies your CICD. Because what happens a lot of times, especially in config management space as well, is people use the tool because a CMP like this didn't exist to do something that the tool wasn't designed to do, which makes your CICD a little more brittle. This eliminates that. It eliminates that overhead. For example, I've seen some config management with CICD pipelines where they're talking to info blocks from this config management to allocate the IP address, which means you have to have a pre-allocated IP address in the first place. All that goes away. All that complexity just disappears because Morpheus is handling that base configuration for you.
You guys would pick up on the deployment. So code check-in, all that stuff goes through your normal CI/CD pipeline for all the testing, and then when you're ready to actually build the infra, that's where this comes in.
Yep.
Okay.
One thing I really like to mention is you look at, deploying to public cloud is a lot easier, right? They've exposed all these APIs. On-prem is a lot more difficult, not because the APIs are bad. Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. But it's because there's so many different components you have to integrate with for on-prem. Someone has different storage implementation. Maybe it's 3PAR, maybe it's NetApp, whatever it is. There's different IP address management. The only way to really make it feel public cloud-like is to pull all those pieces together, glue them together. And so really we make your on-prem almost as consumable as public cloud.
Yeah. Now, in true CXI style, I have 3 questions. So the first one is, all this automation, so is it all API-based?
Yes.
Or are there instances where there are no APIs, you have done something else to make it work?
Okay, so it is all API-based. So there's 2 ways to do that, and that we talked about the automation side, right? There are task types that are a fixed set of task types. So these are strict right here. They could be an SSH, PowerShell, a Chef, Puppet, WinRM. We got a reboot script. There's also some cool ones where I can actually write Groovy code directly. I can write Python. I can write JRuby. This is a way to override the engine. Basically, if we don't have that support for something, you can actually just write the code directly in here. And that can all be pushed from an API and version controlled as well from the CLI, things like that. So it really allows you to override it.
The reason why I was asking was because what if some product doesn't have an API?
Yes.
Then what happens? And
For example, I've seen some products who don't have an API, but they have a PowerShell module. Is that a good example?
exactly. And that's exactly what I was asking.
So
Some
in that case, you would say, I want to run a WinRM script, and you can inject your script. You can inject Morpheus variables into it too, like the instance name. Maybe I want to echo the instance name for the context. I can actually set the execute target to a remote target. Say I have a jump box designed to talk to that PowerShell module where it's already installed. I can give it the credentials to use the jump box to orchestrate it over PowerShell or something like that.
Right. So in some cases, you basically find a way to integrate things, which is great because there will come a day when everything will have an API. We're moving that way, but not everything is there yet.
I have a great example for you for something that required a lot of PowerShell.
SCVMM.
SCVMM. I think we are one of the only people that support orchestrating System Center as completely as vCenter.
Wow.
So,
Yeah.
and that's done via the Morpheus agent using PowerShell commands on the System Center server.
SCVMM is actively terrible, so congratulations on the effort.
But our support is actively good.
Yes, it is.
So that's great because the next follow-on question basically is that when you say that you're agnostic and no vendor lock-in, that kind of thing, that basically means that you start using Morpheus. We don't have to do anything. You're using Morpheus as a glue, but then take away Morpheus and everything falls apart. Is that how it works? Because
Well, we're not in the data plane,
everyone will
so
rely on that.
right, we're not in the data plane. So to a point, you're going to have to make a selection. You pick Kubernetes, take away Kubernetes, everything falls apart, right? So at a point, you are going to need to rely on something. That being said, if you've written a bunch of Ansible playbooks and you're letting Morpheus orchestrate that, you take away Morpheus, there's nothing to say you can't go use another Ansible management tool to kick off the Ansible playbooks.
No, that's
the work is not lost.
Exactly. I mean, something will have to replace it. What I mean is that, the point is the reason why it becomes that way and no lock-in is because you're using the existing mechanisms. You're just putting some glue in between or your own automation. But you're not taking away the mechanisms that already exist. You're still going to use the same one.
Yeah.
I'd maybe articulate it a different way. Your point of abstraction is your point of lock-in, and we've abstracted about as high as you can get to give you degrees of freedom across pretty much any tool in the landscape. So if you're if you're a libertarian, we're the tool for you, right? We're going to give you as many options as you would possibly have.
And that's a great way of doing it because that's exactly, I mean, you're basically giving the user a choice as if they want to use this one big tool and where you've done all the hard work and they're just using it, or they want to do it themselves.
Right.
Either way, fine.
Again, back to our design center, right? We were walking into environments where we didn't get to pick the tools, right? We were going into these portfolio companies that had already had choices. You got tool huggers, you got different groups doing their thing. You just need to make them more efficient and more agile. I've used the kind of self-leveling cement analogy. I've probably spent too much time at Home Depot, but every environment has different cracks and different tools and different processes and different people. We want to be able to lay down, give it a shake, and get you to as frictionless of a plane as possible by filling in the edges and pulling the pieces together.
So, no, that's the end of my questions because you've answered everything.
That was your 1, 2, 3 questions.
Yeah.
And I should mention some of the stuff with those clouds. We talk about Morpheus abstracting all of it and maintaining the state of a lot of it. It also does reverse state too, I should mention. So like, say someone who's using vCenter.
In total.
Okay. Say someone using vCenter wants to change the amount of memory on a VM directly in vSphere. Morpheus will detect that change and automatically adjust the plan and costing tracking in the system as well. So you don't have to say, oh, I better do that in Morpheus to make sure I get that costing change. After 5 minutes, Morpheus will detect that change in a lot of cases. You add a disk, same thing. You change network, same thing. All that will kind of get detected automatically.
Same approach if you're doing it in the cloud as well.
Yes, on that 5-minute sync basis.
Yep.
But also, coming back to that same question I asked earlier, because now you're using all APIs, all libraries, the vendors directly. So then sort of there is a reliance on, for example, using CloudFormation to deploy something and a new feature hasn't yet appeared in CloudFormation. Then are you then handicapped a little bit until they introduce it, or do you do something in between?
It really depends on the customer request. So if it's something that a customer's requested, who is a customer, we do customer feature requests all the time, and it doesn't exist in CloudFormation yet, AWS has exposed the API, we'll go integrate that very easily. We call them provision types. So when you add a cloud exposes provision types. For example, AWS provides lots of them, an RDS provision type, EC2, ECS, EKS, all those types of things. CloudFormation is even one of them. So we can very easily extend that model as well.